April 22nd, 1994.
He was, at one and the same time, one of the most admired and one of the most reviled presidents in our history.
Just think how much you're going to be missing. You don't have Nixon to kick around anymore.
The Chinese people are a great people. The American people are a great people. As we meet here today, we stand on the threshold of a new era of peace in the world.
People have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
Always remember, others may hate you, but those who hate you don't win unless you hate them.
Tonight, Richard Nixon is dead.
This is ABC News Nightline. Reporting from Washington, Ted Koppel.
Richard Nixon. The name itself is sort of a litmus test. If you're under 30, the name provokes only vague memories of Watergate and perhaps that sad two-armed victory salute from the helicopter that would fly him away from the presidency. If you're over 50, you remember the foreign policy triumphs, opening relations with the People's Republic of China, détente with the Soviet Union. All of this startlingly the work of a man who rose to political prominence as one of America's leading anti-communists. And either way, no matter what your age, the visceral reactions that Richard Nixon's name always provoked. Those who felt he raised the presidency to great heights, and those who felt he shamed it beyond redemption. As long as he was alive, Richard Nixon evoked those kinds of feelings, but he always insisted that history would vindicate him and mark him as one of America's great presidents. That kind of evaluation begins in earnest tonight because Richard Nixon died this evening at New York Hospital. My colleague Bob Jameson is standing by at the hospital now. Bob?
Ted, the former president's daughters, Tricia Cox and Julie Eisenhower, were with Mr. Nixon when he died quietly at 9:08 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time this evening on the 4th floor of New York Hospital in the intensive care unit. His family had been with him virtually around the clock since Tuesday, when doctors first discovered swelling of the brain, one of the most feared complications of the massive stroke that he suffered at his New Jersey home on Monday evening. On Wednesday, yesterday, on Thursday, Mr. Nixon fell into a coma, which became even deeper, and death had been imminent all day. Shortly after he died, Mr. Nixon's body was taken from New York Hospital back to New Jersey, where he had lived for some years. It will be in a funeral home there until Tuesday. On Tuesday, Mr. Nixon, accompanied by his family, will fly from Stewart Airport in Newburgh, New York, to El Toro Marine Base in Southern California. It will be taken from there to the Nixon Library at Yorba Linda, where his wife was buried only last June. The body will be available for public viewing, that is, for those who wish to pay their respects in the library, until Wednesday. And then on Wednesday, there will be a private burial on the grounds of the library.
Bob Jameson, thanks very much indeed. Richard Nixon provoked such complex responses because he was such a complicated man. John Ehrlichman, who served him at the White House as one of his principal domestic advisors, captured that complexity.
The problem is that historians are going to grab an hour of tape when these tapes come out, and they're going to say, aha, Richard Nixon is a tree trunk, like the five blind men and the elephant, you know, and the guy grabs the leg and he says an elephant is a tree, and another fellow grabs the tail and says, no, it's a rope. So sometime, hopefully, there will be a historian or a committee of historians who will listen to all the tapes and go into all the archives and then come out and say Richard Nixon was the strangest collection, the strangest paradoxical combination of any man I ever heard of. And they'll be right. He would talk to you in a way that he wouldn't talk to me. He would talk to me in a way that he wouldn't talk to John Mitchell. And if you listen to a snippet of tape, you're going to form an impression of this man that's going to be wrong. He was that, and he was the other thing, and he was also the third thing. And he was those things sometimes all in the same day and sometimes in a series of days. The biographer is going to have a terrible time because everything about him is paradoxical.
Joining us now live, two of the men who know him best. Joining us from Palm Springs, California, former President Gerald R. Ford, who succeeded Mr. Nixon. And from his home in Kent, Connecticut, Henry Kissinger, who served, of course, as his Secretary of State. Mr. President, I know we're going to lose you on the satellite in just a few minutes, so let me begin with you, and let me begin on what you perhaps knew best from your own experience over the many, many years, and that was Richard Nixon, the domestic politician. I don't think many people know. I was talking to our old friend Hal Bruno just a few minutes before the program. How terrific he was when he was on the stump and he would go into a community, and how he knew every Republican in town and their wives and their children. Can you talk about him as a politician on the stump a little bit?
I campaigned with him not only in California on more than one occasion, but he came to my hometown of Grand Rapids, Michigan for a Lincoln Day dinner. He was fabulous. He made a special effort to greet people, to talk to people of all parts of our society in Grand Rapids. He made a fantastic speech, a good, strong Republican foreign policy speech. He left with an indelible impression in that community, and as a result, in subsequent elections, he always did very, very well. He could be a very long day campaigner, speaking 4 or 5 times, shaking hands morning, noon, and night. He was indefatigable when he was on the stump.
I always got the feeling, though, that he was extremely uncomfortable making small talk, and it almost seems as though a politician has to be able to do that. How did he handle that contradiction?
Well, he was hesitant in talking small talk with people he didn't know, Ted, but with people like myself and others in the House or the Senate that he knew well, he could be very, very relaxed, and you could talk about sports. He was an enthusiastic spectator for competitive athletics. He was very knowledgeable about baseball and football. He could do a lot of very interesting small talk, and his factual knowledge of many, many subjects would surprise you on a great many occasions.
Mr. President, you were his vice president during the darkest of his days, that is, the last days of the Watergate investigation, just before he had to resign. Did you see him much during those last few weeks and months, and how was he handling it?
Ted, I didn't see him a great deal because he wanted me, during the 9 months that I was vice president, to go out and campaign on behalf of his policies, on behalf of Republican candidates. I would, of course, attend all national security meetings. I would participate in cabinet meetings. I saw him more than infrequently, but he was very, very preoccupied, as we all know, with trying to resolve what should be done, how we should handle the challenges that resulted from Watergate. And so although we got together on business, there wasn't much time during that very tough period to do much socializing.
You've always been an enormously popular man. The only time that you really took a terrific amount of heat, of course, was when you pardoned President Nixon. Did you ever give that a second thought afterwards? Did you regret it?
Ted, I never regretted it 1 minute. I knew it was the right thing to do. In September of 1974, it was vitally important then to get that problem, Mr. Nixon's difficulties, off the agenda so that I could concentrate on the domestic problems that we had. And as you know, we were on the brink of a very serious economic recession. It was important that I assume the necessary leadership in our foreign policy because we were apprehensive as to what the reaction of the Soviet Union might be. We weren't certain at all that our allies had continued faith in what our policies might be with a change of the presidency. So I felt very strongly that I had to spend all my time on those problems involving 240 million Americans instead of spending 25% of my time listening to lawyers from the Department of Justice and elsewhere, advising me, arguing with me what ought to be done about President Nixon's tapes and papers. So when the crucial point came, I had to make a very tough judgment. I knew it would be bad politically, but it was in the best interest of all Americans for me as a new president to spend 100% of my time working on the problems at home and abroad in the best interest of all Americans.
President Ford, thank you so much. I know you have to go right now, and I very much appreciate your joining us.
Thank you, Ted.
We'll be joined live when we come back by former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger.
This is ABC News Nightline, brought to you by Acura.
Most people have something they're willing to pay a premium for. For some, it's art. For some, it's entertainment. For others, it's travel. Acura. Some things are worth the price.
It's new.
Introducing Thompson's Water Seal Ultra Waterproofer.
It's better.
Easy to see coverage. Dries clear.
It's best.
The best multi-surface waterproofer you can buy. Beats the competition hands down. New Thompson's Ultra.
Not just better, best.
Come to the Sears Day sale. Right now, Bridgestone Road Handler tires are on sale at our lowest prices of the year. You can save $24 to $44 on a set of 4. So roll on into the Sears Tire and Auto Center and grab the savings.
I'm David Brinkley. This Sunday, President Clinton says he always welcomed Richard Nixon's advice on China, Russia, and other places. With Nixon's death, will his ideas live on?
The brake pads may be replaced. The leather may be conditioned. The belts may be changed. In fact, every pre-owned Lexus LS will be nitpicked, scrutinized, and pored over in as many as 100 quality and maintenance checks before it can ever be certified and backed by a special limited warranty. You could say we do the once-over more than once. Lexus certified pre-owned cars only at Lexus of Nashville.
Now you can get 50% off all frames at LensCrafters. 50% off every frame we carry. Other places run discount offers, but the selection is limited or there's some kind of catch. At LensCrafters, it's a real half-price sale, no strings attached. 50% off every single frame we carry, and we'll still make your glasses in about an hour. This is a great deal. People should not miss this.
Hurry, LensCrafters offer ends soon.
Joining us now live from his home in Kent, Connecticut, is the former Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, who served both as Secretary of State and National Security Advisor to Richard Nixon. I'd like to get from you just one observation, and then so that some of the younger members of our audience who perhaps don't know that much about Richard Nixon have a sense. We're going to go to a piece from my colleague Jeff Greenfield and then come back to you. Here was this man who, after all, in his younger years, was the archdeacon of anti-communism, loathed communism publicly and about as adamantly as anyone in the United States. What was it like with him when you and he landed in Beijing, where he would be greeted by Zhou Enlai and then ultimately would meet Mao Zedong?
Of course, I only met Richard Nixon in 1969. And from the beginning of my association with him, he was not a doctrinaire anti-communist. He opposed communism as a philosophy violently. But he recognized that in order to bring peace, he had to have a relationship with China, that we could not exclude 1 billion Chinese from the international relationships without weakening our own position. And he looked at the Soviet Union as a strategic adversary, and as an ideological adversary. But in terms of foreign policy, he believed that to have more options than your adversary strengthens you rather than weakens you. And therefore, he had no emotional complex at all about landing in Beijing, because he thought he was isolating North Vietnam. He was getting himself negotiating cards vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, and that if he played his cards well, he would be in control of the process that would result, and he knew how to play his cards well.
All of it that sort of cool and analytical. I mean, what I'm trying to get to is it's very difficult to get behind that mask. He was not a man who showed a great deal of emotion, and yet on that cold winter morning when you and he arrived in Beijing, there must have been some sense of excitement, some sense of the history of the moment?
No, he was a very complicated man, as John Ehrlichman said, though perhaps for a different reason than John Ehrlichman pointed out. One side of him was extremely emotional, and the discipline front was perhaps in order to prevent the emotional side from breaking out. His emotion in China did not occur when he was landing. That's when he was totally focused on what he had to do. The emotional moment with him on China came on our last night in Shanghai, when neither of us could sleep, and we sat on the veranda of the suite that he had, looking at the lights of Shanghai, which were not very strong in those early period of Chinese industrialization. And there he was quite emotional about how far he had come, what all of this meant, and where it would all lead. That's when one could see the reflective, well, more than the reflective, that's when we could see the Nixon who translated his achievement into human terms. But actually, when we were landing, I was with him. He was focused on what he was going to say, on the meeting he was going to have with Mao and Zhou Enlai, and only after the communique had been completed 4 or 5 days later did he let go when we were alone and we were leaving the next morning.
Dr. Kissinger, I'd like to get similar sorts of observations from you on Vietnam and the Soviet Union and Richard Nixon's life with regard to both of those crises in our history in just a few moments. But first, as I mentioned a moment ago, I think perhaps it's necessary to step back and take a look at the life as a whole. And we've asked my colleague Jeff Greenfield to do a short essay for us on the life of Richard Nixon.
Back when television was a first faint flicker, when Milton Berle was the first media celebrity, Richard Nixon was already a national political figure. Back when Joe DiMaggio and Jackie Robinson were the giants of baseball, when Bogart and Bacall were the giants of the silver screen, Nixon was already one of the most polarizing politicians in America, a hero of the anti-communist right, a villain of the liberal left. He appeared on the national scene almost half a century ago, when the public schools of the South and of the nation's capital were still racially segregated, when not a single woman sat on the U.S. Supreme Court or in the United States Senate or in a governor's mansion, when barely 1 in 10 mothers of young children worked outside the home. Through all the years and all that has changed, he never left. The public life of Richard Nixon spans nearly a quarter of our country's history. Look at that life, and you can, of course, see a man whose triumphs and disasters no novelist would dare create. But you can also see how intimately Richard Nixon was bound up with our most compelling causes and controversies. To begin with, there was communism, the ideology that defined much of the last half-century of our foreign and domestic politics. Richard Nixon was elected to Congress in 1946 by painting his opponent, Jerry Voorhees, as a communist sympathizer. He won his Senate race against Helen Gahagan Douglas 4 years later the same way. In 1952, he assaulted the Democratic Party as soft on communism. His kitchen confrontation with Soviet Premier Khrushchev at a Moscow trade fair in 1959 became a symbol of Nixon's anti-communism.
There may be some instances, for example, color television, where we're ahead of you.
But by the time Nixon had become president, confrontation had given way to a much less ideological view of the now divided communist world. So in 1969, he traveled to Romania, becoming the first American president ever to make a state visit to a communist nation, and encouraging Romania's independence from Moscow. Nixon visited mainland China in 1972 and instantly changed the international chessboard by opening relations with a communist nation increasingly at odds with the Soviet Union. Later that year, he went to Moscow to sign the first strategic arms limitation pact with the Soviet Union, an unmistakable sign that this most ardent anti-communist of his time had come to believe some measure of cooperation was critical to the cause of peace. Ironically, only a few months ago, Richard Nixon was in Moscow again, this time ruffling the feathers of Boris Yeltsin, the first post-communist leader, when he met with opposition politicians. At age 81, Richard Nixon was still a hard-nosed political realist.
And the Russian-American relationship is the most important relationship that the United States has with any nation in the world.
You can also follow Richard Nixon's career and track much of television's rise as a political power. We call JFK our first television president. We call Ronald Reagan the great communicator. But in this famous 1952 speech, Richard Nixon became our first TV politician. Charged with financial wrongdoing, urged to quit the GOP ticket, Nixon instead went on national television and talked, over the heads of the press and the leaders of his own party, directly to the people, with his now famous acknowledgement of a gift from a supporter.
It was a little Cocker Spaniel dog in a crate that he'd sent all the way from Texas. Black and white, spotted. And our little girl, Tricia, the 6-year-old, named it Check.
Sentimental pap, said his opponents, but 1 million telegrams flooded Republican headquarters, demanding he be kept on as Eisenhower's running mate. Much to Ike's amazement, it was the beginning of the modern era of media politics. It is also now official history that Nixon lost the 1960 presidential race because he was badly lit and badly made up for his first televised debate with John Kennedy.
If you want a man with leadership, then Nixon is for you.
And 2 years later, when he lost his bid to become governor of California, Nixon violated a primal law of television. Don't lose your temper in the glare of the media spotlight.
You don't have Nixon to kick around anymore.
But in 1968, a quarter century before Bill Clinton's campaign, Nixon used television to convey the image of a man eager to exchange views with ordinary citizens.
You, Richard Milhouse Nixon.
And in 1968, he won. You can also look at Richard Nixon and see the rise of political protest in America. Protest that both helped him win the presidency and led to its collapse. By 1968, the peaceful civil rights movement had at times turned into something more dangerous. City neighborhoods in flames, guns and troops in the streets. Richard Nixon tapped into the backlash against that violence and disorder, and in so doing, he created a way to reach traditional Democrats in the South and in the suburbs that created an all but impregnable Republican lock on the White House for a quarter of a century.
As long as I am president, no band of violent thugs is going to keep me from going out and speaking with the American people whenever they want to hear me and whenever I want to go.
But for all he gained politically from his posture as the candidate of law and order, the upheaval surrounding the Vietnam War led eventually to his undoing. Nixon's administration saw the anti-war protests as a threat to the Republic. That view led in 1971 to the biggest mass arrest in American history, when thousands of anti-war demonstrators were rounded up and detained in the nation's capital. It was part of Richard Nixon's essential makeup to see enemies everywhere, not just in the streets, but in the Congress, in the halls of the universities and think tanks, and especially in the press. That view led to the creation of a secret White House group, the Plumbers, whose job was to discredit the protesters and to stop the leaks of information to those who opposed the war and to the press. In June of 1972, those plumbers were caught burglarizing Democratic National Headquarters at the Watergate complex. And then everything came apart.
ABC News presents Impeachment. Congress deliberates.
Facing certain impeachment and removal from office, Nixon resigned, with the most remarkably revealing self-analysis ever delivered by a president.
Always remember, others may hate you. But those who hate you don't win unless you hate them. And then you destroy yourself.
Richard Nixon left the White House in disgrace because he never really knew himself well enough to resist that impulse against which he warned. He saw enemies everywhere, and in his fever to strike out against them, he dealt himself a mortal political wound. But he knew enough about America for one last triumph. He knew enough to retreat from the spotlight, to let time do its work of dimming the roar of old battles, and to reappear in the last decade of his life as a wise and shrewd observer of the world scene. And even though he died in the fullness of his years, it is still something of a shock, given all that he survived, that this remarkable run has finally ended. I'm Jeff Greenfield for Nightline in New York.
And what we're going to be looking at right now is a live picture of the Capitol. And as the camera zooms in, you will be able to see that the flag in its traditional position now of marking the death of a prominent American leader is at half-staff. This, of course, marking the death earlier this evening of Richard M. Nixon at the age of 81. As we stay on that picture now, we have, and Dr. Kissinger, if you'll be kind enough just to stand by for another moment or two, we have by telephone the Reverend Billy Graham. Reverend Graham, can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can, Ted. Thank you.
I appreciate your joining us. You spent some time with the family, or at least spoke to the family, I understand, did you not?
Yes, I was, I think, the first one at the hospital when he had his attack, and Tricia was already there, and Julie was on the way from Philadelphia, and I had a time with both of them, and we had prayer together.
How are they handling the stress?
Oh, they're handling it beautifully. They love their father. They adored their father and their mother. It was a tremendously close family, and but the thing that has held them up, I think, is their faith in God.
Reverend Graham, you have ministered not only to millions, but I guess you've ministered to just about every president, going back how far? Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, how far back do you go?
Well, Harry Truman was the first, and I'm not sure I ministered to him, but the rest of them, perhaps, I did.
In terms of dealing with a man when he went through troubled times, how do you, as you look back now on the life of Richard Nixon, how do you assess his presidency? How do you assess his time with us as a leader?
Well, of course, I knew him as a friend, and he and I were very close friends. And I suppose I figured out that I played at least 100 games of golf with him. And when you play that much golf with a man, you get to know him. I've been in his home many times and knew Pat very well, and held those two girls on my lap when they were little children. And it's been a family friendship. He visited my home, and I visited his, and he knew my wife and her family, and we had a wonderful relationship. And I think he was one of the most misunderstood men in some ways, and yet he was one of the greatest men of this century.
I don't want to keep you, Reverend Graham, but just you've piqued my curiosity now. Most misunderstood in what sense?
Pardon?
I say you've piqued my curiosity when you say most misunderstood. In what sense?
Well, I think people never saw the gentle and the human and the gracious and the thoughtful side of Richard Nixon. It's true that he seemed to be difficult for other people to get to know. He was not difficult for me to get to know. I don't know how that happened, but we became close friends from the first time we met in 1950. I knew his father and mother before I knew him. And we just became personal friends that has lasted till now.
And I understand you'll be officiating at the memorial service next week?
I think so, yes.
All right, Reverend Graham. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. I appreciate you taking the time.
All right. Thank you, Ted.
We'll be back with more in a moment.
With so many people still enjoying the service and convenience of their local True Value, another use may have to be found for those humongous hardware warehouses. Get a quart of Ortho Weed Be Gone Weed Killer for $6.44 and a bag of Green Thumb Lawn Food for $4.99 at True Value. Quantities are limited.
Tower, I think I once bought a lawnmower here.
We designed a new car. We created a new class. We developed new engineering. We created a new standard of performance. We redefined value. Introducing the Mercedes-Benz C-Class. It wasn't designed to compete with other cars. It was designed to replace them. The new C-Class starting at under $30,000.
You know, you can order any item in a restaurant and know exactly how much you're going to pay.
Sunny side up and whole wheat.
Because in a restaurant, the price of every item is listed right on the menu. Same's true at Bell Ford. They put the price on every car and truck, so you know how much you're paying right up front. No haggling, no negotiations. So why don't other car dealers put their prices on the windshield? Guess they look at you as their meal ticket.
Bell Ford. One low price, no high pressure.
One of the most important things that people can do when they have a choice or their business has a choice of health plans is to look very carefully at who is included in that plan. And I would personally be very, very leery of any plan that did not include St. Thomas as an option. It doesn't have to be the only one, but I would sure want it to be included in the plan.
To find out if we're part of your health plan, call and just ask St. Thomas.
Lexus LS custom-tailored lease. The fact that the LS holds its value so well is one reason why you can now lease it for less than you could in 1989. This lease is so inspiring, so uplifting, so profound. Our lawyers were moved to write this heroic epic commemorating it. The Lexus LS, only $569 a month. Lease one today at Lexus of Nashville.
Joining us now live from New York, former speechwriter to Richard Nixon, Ray Price. Chuck Colson was special counsel to in the Nixon White House, rather. He joins us now live here in our Washington bureau. Chuck, it's good to see you again after all these years. It must be an extraordinary feeling for you. Richard Nixon was, for so much of your life, really a major figure, wasn't he?
Yes, he certainly was, Ted, and I had enormous admiration for him. So this is a very sad night for me, and I agree with what Billy Graham said. He's a much misunderstood man. I knew the kind, decent, caring side of him and the wonderful family man that he was, and so I feel a great personal loss tonight, not only for the nation, but for me personally.
Tell us a little about, I mean, in a sense, I think John Ehrlichman had it right when he talked about the 5 or 7 blind men touching the elephant, and each man touched a different part of the elephant and described a different reality. What was the reality that you knew?
Well, I first knew Richard Nixon in 1956, and I was struck by his uncommon sense of vision for peace in the world, great idealist, and his incredible intellect, most formidable intellect I think I've encountered in my lifetime. And so I saw him as vice president, and then I met him many times during the period that he was out of office. I saw him mature, his views about the world and about public life change. And I also saw the darker side come out of Nixon, and as I'm sure people have said, I probably contributed to that to some extent. And a lot of it was due, however, to the time we lived in. In the 60s, this was a very ugly period in American history when he became president. A very divisive war going on, campus unrest sweeping across the country. He was elected by a tiny margin at the last moment with 43% of the vote. So we came into the White House into a rather inhospitable environment, and it was a we versus them mentality that I think deepened during the first Nixon term, the first term in office.
When you talk about that darker side, though, it also goes back to the 1950s when he was running against Helen Gahagan Douglas, for example. Remember he called her, what was it, the Pink Lady.
Well, I think...
I mean, it was a mean campaign on both sides, but somehow that's inconsistent, or it seems inconsistent with that gentle, sensitive man you're describing.
I'm not so sure, Ted, because Jerry Voorhees, after the first campaign for Congress, complimented Nixon on the way he had handled it. I think the Helen Gahagan Douglas campaign has been blown out of all proportion. John Kennedy would have to be the first to testify, were he here today, that Nixon could have contested the 1960 election, had very good reason for doing so, did not. And I was just with George McGovern today, who looks with great graciousness upon Richard Nixon as a formidable opponent. They fought hard, but he came away with a very great respect for him. So I'm not so sure that that reputation, that's a little bit what Billy Graham means. He's been a very misunderstood man in American politics.
Ray Price, you and I first met in 1968 when I was covering the Nixon campaign for ABC News. You were then, I guess, beginning as a speechwriter for him, or had you been with him for some time?
I joined him in early 1967 when there was just a small group of us, including Pat Buchanan, who were helping him prepare what might become a campaign for the presidency in 1968, and we did a bit of everything in those early days.
He was a man who never gave up, and I guess that's why it was so extraordinary when in 1962 he had that famous blow-up with the press that Jeff Greenfield was talking about, where he said, well, you'll never have Richard Nixon to kick around anymore. What made him change his mind? What made him decide to run for the presidency?
Well, he didn't really decide until the beginning of 1968. It was an open question right up really until the moment of decision. This was his life. Public policy was his life. The world was his concern, and obviously, the presidency was there. He had fought for it once before. He really thought that he was the best prepared man for the job, the best qualified for it, and he thought there was a fair chance that he could win it, and therefore he felt that it was time to get back into the arena and run for it.
Let me just introduce one more guest who is joining us now live from WVUE-TV in New Orleans. Stephen Ambrose is a University of New Orleans historian. He wrote what is unquestionably the definitive biographical series on President Nixon. And Professor Ambrose, when we come back, I wonder if you could be searching your memory now for what you think is perhaps the most definitive story, or the most descriptive, or the one that in a sense captures Richard Nixon the best. And we'll come back with you and Ray Price and Chuck Colson in just a moment.
I'm playing Pete's Comedy Pagoda tonight. I'm staying here at the Super 8 Motel. My favorite place. I love this room, don't you? Super 8 rooms are always affordable and roomy. And steamy. What a great TV. Just like mine, except this one works. 4 more hours to showtime. Okay, new joke. That's funny. No, it's not.
Super 8. 1-800-800-8000. Over 1,000 affordable, comfortable locations nationwide. Life's great at Super 8.
Come to the Sears Day sale. Right now, Bridgestone Road Handler tires are on sale at our lowest prices of the year. You can save $24 to $44 on a set of 4. So roll on into the Sears Tire and Auto Center and grab the savings.
One shot. That's all it takes for weeds. Roundup.
Continuous improvement through constant innovation. It's how Cadillac is creating a higher standard with America's favorite luxury sedan, the 1994 Cadillac DeVille. Completely redesigned with more than 100 newly refined features, each created to keep the driving experience as rewarding as possible. And now DeVille's newest innovation, a $399 a month lease for 24 months with $2,400 down. Cadillac DeVille, creating a higher standard.
Monday, living on the wrong side of the law was the only thing she knew.
Hi, baby. Hey, car.
Now she must resist the temptation of the past
You ain't changed a bit.
and get her life on the right track.
If you violate any of these rules, you'll be back in jail so fast you won't even know you've ever been out.
Getting out was the easy part. Staying out will be the challenge of her life. Rebecca De Mornay, Ellen Burstyn.
What am I gonna do?
Getting Out, a world premiere presentation, Monday here on ABC.
Now let me get this straight. You want a great deal on a new car, and you're considering a Pontiac Grand Am or a Nissan Altima? You do want air conditioning and cassette, right? No problem on this Grand Am, but they cost a lot more on the Altima. Automatic transmission? Hey, it's included in the Grand Am's price. And you want anti-lock brakes, right? Well, that's a biggie for the import. So you want all that and you're considering the Altima? I thought you wanted a great deal. The Grand Am 199 Smart Drive at your Pontiac people of Middle Tennessee and Western Kentucky.
A young girl tricks a small town into believing she's a he.
The only thing we ever did was just kiss. I thought Brandon was the best person I could have ever met in my whole life.
But when the truth came out,
He was actually a woman. So that's what I want to be. Just let me be what I want to be.
police say her closest friends planned to kill her. On the next Maury Povich Show, it's a bizarre story of sex and betrayal that led to murder. On the next Maury.
Maury Povich, Monday morning at 9 on Channel 2.
At 9:08 in New York at the age of 81. And we are back with three men who knew him well. Stephen Ambrose, Ray Price, and Charles Colson. Mr. Ambrose, you have written, as I said, the definitive histories of him. And I wonder what you think it is about him that evokes such visceral responses. I mean, he evoked great loyalty among some and enormous and enduring hostility among others.
Hatred even.
Hatred, exactly.
Hatred even, yes, that's right. A shockingly high number of American people actually hated the man. He did excite the most extreme reactions. I think the story that, to me, typifies Nixon most is a college classmate of his observed that Dick Nixon's not the kind of a guy you want to go backpacking with. And his cousin, Jesmond West, said even as a small boy, he wasn't the kind of a kid you wanted to pick up and hug. But he was the kind of man you wanted to vote for to be president. He was, I know a man in Whittier I interviewed who said he voted for Nixon 16 times for president, for 8th grade, for junior high school, for high school, and Whittier College, for the Rotary afterwards, and so on. And Nixon wasn't a man who wanted people's love.
In a curious way,
he wanted their respect, and in his own way, he earned it from all Americans, really, by the time the end came today.
Well, as I think I mentioned at the top of the broadcast, he wrote 9 books after he left the presidency. He was clearly determined, Ray Price, wasn't he, to reestablish himself in the minds of as many Americans as he could as an elder statesman.
Well, I'd say it was a little the other way around. He was, in writing those books and in playing the role he did post-presidency, he was doing what for him came naturally. I worked with him on some of those. I spent a lot of the post-presidency time with him. And, again, his concern was the world. He knew the world. He knew that he knew the world. I traveled with him a lot abroad after the presidency, and he's greeted with enormous respect wherever he went abroad by all the leaders. And they wanted his thoughts, and he knew that he had something to say, and he wanted to be useful. He could not live without being useful. I remember once he commented to me that if he ever had to do something like returning to the practice of law, he'd be mentally dead in 6 months and physically dead in a year. He just had to be engaged in the world, and this was one way that he had to do it. And also it kept him mentally alert, it kept him focused. He used the books to refine ideas as well as to express them to try to persuade people.
Chuck Colson, you paid the price for some of the crimes you committed, and indeed for many, many years now have been active in a prison ministry and have done an awful lot of good. As you look back on those pre-Watergate days, what was it? I mean, here was a man who in so many ways had it made. It really wasn't necessary. And I guess the question that so many people have asked about Watergate is why? Why was that a necessary thing to do?
Well, I look back now as a Christian, Ted, and I am horrified by some of the things I said on the tapes and some of the locker room conversation. But you've got to remember the atmosphere, as I was mentioning before. When we came to the city, it was extremely inhospitable. This country was ripped apart. We were elected with 43% of the vote, barely made it into office in 1968, and never once in the polls, from the first day that we walked into the White House, never once in the polls did we rise above 50%. As a matter of fact, we were always trailing Ed Muskie right into the spring of 1972. Most people figured Nixon would be a one-term president. I remember January 1972, Nixon assembled his entire official family, the cabinet, senior White House staff. We had a dinner in the East Room at the White House. He said, we may be gray, dull men. It may only be one term, but we're here to do the best we can for peace in the world. There was almost a sense of resignation that we were likely not going to be reelected. So a lot of campaign operatives did overly zealous things, dirty tricks, and of course Watergate was one of those that flowed out of it. Nixon never knew about that. I'm absolutely convinced of it. But there was this frantic desire to try to hang on to the White House that we had barely won and never really enjoyed a majority support for it during the Nixon presidency. Sometimes he'd go up in the polls, but never in a head-to-head contest with a potential opponent in the 1972 election.
Mr. Ambrose, let me hear the historian's view here, because he always believed, and I talked to him quite a few times after he left the White House and visited him out at his home in New Jersey, and he clearly believed that history was going to vindicate him. I guess the question is, what does vindication mean in this sense? Clearly, Watergate can't be forgotten.
Watergate will never be forgotten. Watergate is the spot that will not out. A high school history text 200 years from now that gives one paragraph to President Nixon will begin with, he was the only president who had to resign his office. That is the starter. Then after that, there's a great deal to be said, of course. There's a lot more to Nixon than Watergate. They'll talk, the textbook will talk about the opening to China, détente with the Soviet Union, ending the war in Vietnam. But the starting point is always going to be the only president who was forced to resign his office in disgrace.
He was terribly proud, Ray Price, of some of his domestic achievements also. You want to just list a few of those?
Well, of course, one would be he successfully integrated the schools of the South and did it peacefully, which people thought could not be done. He did it by including the South in the process, by treating them with respect, and they responded. He was ahead of his time on a lot of things he tried to do, like trying to get power away from Washington. It was unpopular at the time. It's becoming more popular now. He was very proud of what he did in reshaping the courts. He didn't get as far as he might have wished with that, but getting them back a little closer to more judicial restraint. But you know, Ted, I think really if you want to remember Richard Nixon in terms of what he did, you've got to focus primarily on the world. Remember, he was one of the towering figures of the 20th century in this world, and he was a central player in the central struggle of the 20th century, which was that between the forces of freedom and the forces opposed to freedom. And his role, the way he played his role had a lot to do with eventually ensuring the triumph of the forces of freedom.
Chuck, I don't want to end on this note, but I do want to ask you, what's your theory? Why didn't he destroy the tapes? Would have made all the difference, wouldn't it?
Well, I was just reading a very good biography by Jonathan Aitken, the Minister of State for Defense in England, and he said that was an agonizing decision while Nixon was in the hospital at Bethesda. And at one point, Nixon told Al Haig, bring all the tapes in here to the hospital room. Nixon was obviously under medication. He was not thinking clearly. Haig and Bazart proposed he burn the tapes. Garment said no. There was a great fight. And ultimately, according to Aitken's analysis, based on many interviews, including with Nixon, Nixon kept them because he thought they would eventually be exculpatory and defend him in case Haldeman and Ehrlichman turned against him. It was a terrible decision. He should have gotten rid of them the moment he knew that their existence was to be disclosed by Alex Butterfield.
Gentlemen, I thank you all very much. Chuck Colson, Stephen Ambrose, Ray Price, good of you to join us this evening. Thanks so much. We'll be back with some thoughts on Richard Nixon from Barbara Walters in just a moment.
Every year, one credit card gives you something other credit cards don't. Only the Discover card offers you a cashback bonus award. Cash. Over $400 million paid so far. And there's no annual fee. So use the Discover card and improve your cash flow. It pays to Discover, the card that pays you back.
Ever ask yourself, why should you have to wash all the dishes before you wash the dishes? With a Maytag Jet Clean dishwasher, you don't have to. Its 43 powerful jets scrub every surface, it filters the food particles and disposes. Maytag is the dishwasher that asks the question, who needs you?
Where have I heard that?
Maytag, the dependability people.
Allergies can ruin my day. My husband's a doctor and could prescribe anything for me, but he recommends Dimetap Extentabs.
Extentab's powerful formula provides not 4, not 6, but 12 full hours of adult allergy relief.
One tablet lets me keep going all day.
Doctors have recommended the Dimetap brand over 200 million times, including 12-hour Dimetap Extentabs.
I trust my husband, and he trusts Dimetap.
In just 5 years, 2 dogs
can multiply to more than 300. 2 cats to over 12,000. If you haven't spayed or neutered your pet, you're part of the problem. This problem. Every month, unwanted dogs and cats like these and a million more like them across America will be put to death. The solution: spay or neuter your pet. Call 1-800-248-SPAY.
World War II raged for 6 long years. During the 50th anniversary of this war, we pause to remember and honor these uncommon patriots, both living and dead, their families, and those who served in the home front. I'm Sheldon Heston. A grateful nation remembers.
Time you appear, since 1974, there is always a chorus of criticism that says, why are you putting that man on television? He disgraced the office of the presidency, shouldn't be there, you shouldn't be listening to what he has to say.
Oh, I understand the criticism, but I also understand that in today's world, it's important to hear from people who have experience in world affairs and who have something to say that needs to be said. And in my last book, Seize the Moment, I try to do that. And I think it's very important that I do continue to do that. It would be easy for me to do like many other former officials, to spend my time relaxing, playing golf, playing bridge, and that sort of thing. But as far as I'm concerned, when I have so little time left, I want to use every minute of it sharing my views to the extent that they are useful with others. Whether they disagree with them or not, I think it's important now that we hear all the views we can possibly get so that we make the right decision.
Our friend and colleague Barbara Walters also knew Richard Nixon for much of his political life. She shares with us now some of her memories on tape of the man so few people really got to know.
He was often described as complex, and he was. I interviewed him many times, traveled on the historic trip to China with him, where he introduced me to Premier Zhou Enlai by saying, "This is Barbara Walters. We're just breaking her in." He always tried to be friendly, complimenting me on my dress or my hair, but it usually seemed awkward. And if one tried to break through the barrier with a personal question, the warmth faded and his guard went up.
You know, Mr. Nixon, again and again, when people have written books about you, people who worked for you, people who were close to you in one way or another, they say that you are cold, remote, and that they were unable to reach you. Why do you think this is, or do you think this is an apt description?
Why are you interviewing me then?
Why am I interviewing? Yeah. No, I'm not talking about, I don't know you very well. I'm not talking about whether I find you cold or remote. I'm talking about even people like Henry Kissinger, who knows you very well. Talk about this remoteness, this inability to reach you.
I like Henry very much.
Let us go on. In those days...
Why don't we get serious?
Well, because I think people are still, I am serious. People are interested in you. People are still trying to understand you. I'm sorry you find it, that you find these questions unserious. We have a different idea, perhaps, of what serious is, but let me go on.
No, I'm not objecting to the questions, you know.
I'm very serious.
Not at all.
In those early days after Watergate, I don't know whether you'll find this serious, but I'm serious about it. Were there times when you thought you might go under emotionally?
Not at all.
This was part of a 1-hour live interview with Richard Nixon in 1980, 6 years after his resignation. Mr. Nixon's closing answer has been repeated again and again throughout the years.
In just a few seconds we have left now, and there's almost just time for a yes or no. Are you sorry you didn't burn the tapes?
Yes, I think so, because they were private conversations subject to misinterpretation, as we have all seen.
One of the mysteries of Richard Nixon was his personal relationship with his wife, Pat. He rarely talked about her in interviews, and when you consider that Mrs. Nixon worked hard to avoid the spotlight, that left only his children to shed light on their relationship. I spoke with Julie Nixon Eisenhower in November of 1986.
Was it love at first sight? Not for her, but for him, that's yes, because he proposed the first night he met her. And he's a shy, sensitive person, not usually impulsive, but he told her after they'd met at tryouts for a little theater play, He said, "You may not believe this, but I'm going to marry you someday."
I think many people will be surprised to know how romantic your father was. And your mother also must have been, because she kept all of your father's letters.
Yes, she saved everything. My father called Mother his dearest heart. And in this letter he says, "When the winds blow and the rains fall and the sun shines through the clouds, as it is now, I still resolve, as I did then, that nothing so fine ever happened to me or anyone else as falling in love with thee, my dearest heart. Love, Dick."
One of the rare times that Pat Nixon had a dancing partner was at daughter Tricia's wedding.
I remember that at one point she impulsively hugged your father. It was one of the few outward signs of demonstration, of affection that we saw. Do you remember? He didn't hug her back. And I remember we all said, "Oh, look at that. Why doesn't he hug her back?"
Yeah.
They very rarely showed public affection.
Well, you know, they're just very private, and they didn't feel comfortable kissing and hugging in public. Some people are like that.
President Nixon was in so many ways a contradictory man, surprising. For example, his response when I asked him in 1985,
"How would you like to be remembered?"
I suppose everyone would like to be remembered particularly for his major achievements. Most people would point, for example, to the opening to China, which changed the world. But as I look back during the White House years, I think, for example, of an initiative which many people have forgotten, the Cancer Initiative. You remember we started that in 1971. What I'm suggesting here is that we all think of, well, he went to China. He ended the war in Vietnam. He opened relations with the Soviet Union through détente. But in my view, if the Cancer Initiative, which we began, could save lives, that'd be worth all the rest put together.
On June 22nd, 1993, Pat Nixon died after a long bout with lung cancer. The fact that her husband has followed her less than 1 year later may be the one thing about this complex former president that isn't difficult to understand.
And we will be back with a program note in a moment.
If your bag is great values, come to the Sears Day sale at Sears Branch Central. This Kenmore self-cleaning electric range is only $399.99 with digital clock and timer. This Kenmore self-cleaning extra large capacity gas range is just $499.99. It's hard to find better self-cleaning ranges at better prices. Prices that won't hang around for long. So come to Sears Branch Central before Saturday, where you'll find Sears Day savings in the bag.
Sunday on This Week with David Brinkley, the latest on Bosnia, and a look at the legacy of Richard Nixon. Secretary of State Warren Christopher and former Senator Howard Baker will be among the guests. And that's our report for tonight. I'm Ted Koppel in Washington. For all of us here at ABC News, good night.
A printed transcript of Nightline, please send $5 to 1535 Grant Street, Denver, Colorado 80203. If you wish a videocassette version of Nightline, the cost is $14.98 plus $3.95 shipping and handling.
Nightline is a presentation of ABC News. More Americans get their news from ABC News than from any other source.
Saturday.
Warp speed, Mr. Silla.